So can my cat talk or read or write or construct a podcast? No. In that regard, I would say you're more intelligent.
Well, you might be wrong based on the glitch I made in uploading the last episode with this title. If you're seeing this for the second time, it's because I uploaded the wrong interview. Apologies to Hank and to Sebastian. This is the corrected version with Hank's interview. Welcome back to another installment of Data Skeptic Animal Intelligence. I'm joined as always this season by co-host Becky Hansis O'Neill. Welcome back, Becky.
It's great to be back. Thanks, Kyle.
So I was very excited when you first sent me our guest today, Hank's initial paper titled The Myth of Intelligence. How'd you come across this?
So I was looking specifically for somebody, because I know this exists out there in the behavioral sciences, that would say, I don't study intelligence and I don't want to. It's not a great concept in the colloquial sense. And someone who could really dig into why they think that and the theory behind that. So when I found Hank's paper, The Myth of Intelligence, even though I think the paper itself was a little bit older, I thought, this is perfect.
Yeah.
And when I kept looking, Hank was just more and more perfect. So I was really happy to have someone who could come in and break this down from more of a philosophical perspective.
Yeah, he really frames the idea of intelligence and hits on some key points that I'll leave for listeners to hear in the interview, but resonated with me very well, even coming from a very different background.
Yeah, Hank's a behavior analyst, and I was specifically looking for behavior analysts like Hank because they want psychology to be a natural science where we're only looking at observable things we can count. How many times did the rat press the lever? How many times did that human roll their eyes in an interaction? Or how many times did they solve this problem on an IQ test? So they're really not interested in intelligence, or I would say emotions would also fall in there as well. So these things that are these sort of nebulous, emergent properties that we all use all the time in non-scientific conversation. And they say, you know what, that's not very naturalistic. We don't have good operational definitions for any of these things. Let's put them over there and focus on what we can measure, which is going to be behavior. And I would argue now more neuroscience as well. There's some issues with correlating what's going on in the brain with behavior, but that's a whole other episode, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think very early days for that field, if my understanding's correct.
For the neuro stuff?
Yeah, like linking an MRI to what someone's actually thinking.
Exactly. I think people think it's more advanced than it is, and it is advancing very, very rapidly. There are cool things every year coming out. But yeah, I do think people don't necessarily understand scientifically how you link what's going on in an MRI with other things that you want to study. And that is pretty early, I would think.
Hank has a great phrase that I've already stolen and used 3 times. He says, intelligence is an adjective, not a noun.
Excellent.
So we'll hear that and more right after the break. Recently, the world learned of the power of artificial intelligence, a technology cybersecurity leaders have been leveraging for years. Now, as AI expands and evolves, those same security leaders are left wondering where humans fit into the next generation of AI-empowered security tools and solutions. Arctic Wolf, the industry leader in managing security operations, seeks to understand this question in the newly published report, The Human-AI Partnership. Access the insights of over 800 cybersecurity decision-makers in North America and the United Kingdom to better understand how organizations are weighing the benefits and risks of deploying AI tools. Uncover the biggest obstacles to turning AI and human engineers into a formidable team. Discover why the near-term benefits of large language models are being upended by a crucial flaw in the technology. And learn what the risks of AI tools mean for human practitioners moving forward. Get your copy of this report today at arcticwolf.com/dataskeptic. That's Arctic, A-R-C-T-I-C, Wolf, WOLF.com/dataskeptic, all one word. arcticwolf.com/dataskeptic.
My name is Dr. Hank Schlinger. I am professor of psychology at California State University, Los Angeles.
And can you share some details on the types of research you do?
Mostly, I do theoretical writing. My days of laboratory research are over. having done research on basic learning mechanisms, mostly in rats and pigeons, but also in human children. But I would say for the past, couple of decades or more, I've tackled theoretical issues in psychology and in behavior analysis, attempting to interpret traditional psychological concepts in a more parsimonious, at least in my view, a more parsimonious and scientific way. Many of my peer-reviewed publications, my publications in Skeptic Magazine, for example, and Skeptical Inquirer, and my books all kind of converge on that basic theme.
One of the papers that stood out for me is The Myth of Intelligence. Could you, I don't know if we have to give the ending away right off the top, you're welcome to, but could you at least share a bit from the abstracts for listeners who haven't read it yet?
As I said, I've tackled some major concepts and terminology in the field of psychology. Intelligence was one of them. I've also tackled the concept of consciousness and other concepts like memory and things, but not in as lengthy a fashion. But basically, I would say that the approach towards those concepts, including intelligence, is that they're just words. We use them in a way that leads us to believe that they actually have reference. Like, for example, here's my iPhone, and I have a word for that. It's called iPhone or smartphone. And here's an actual referent for it, right? You can see the phone, you can talk on it, you can do whatever. And we have that for everything: chairs, guitars, glasses, cars, right? The words have reference, physical, tangible, concrete reference. Well, where's the referent for intelligence or consciousness or memory? Because despite the fact that psychologists and others have done decades of research, thousands of research studies, not a single one of those studies has ever observed directly any of those reference. To me, that's a red flag. And so the myth of intelligence takes that general approach and applies it to this concept of intelligence. And basically, I don't mind giving away the punchline, basically suggesting that intelligence as a thing, as an entity or a thing that people possess and that determines their behavior is a myth.
And you'd mentioned that in the experiments it's not observed directly. What would it even mean to observe intelligence directly?
I don't think it would mean anything because no one has ever done that. No one has ever observed memory directly, and yet there are thousands of experiments on so-called memory. And I know what the critics will say. Sometimes they'll say, well, in other sciences, the scientists speculate about unseen things. And I addressed that actually in an article I wrote for Skeptical Inquirer called On Planets and Cognitions. I forget the subtitle. But basically what I said was that in the natural sciences like chemistry and biology and physics, they've already done the legwork. They've already done the observational experimental stuff before they move on to theorizing about unseen things. And the unseen things they theorize about are just more examples of the things they've seen close up in the lab. They're not speculating about things that they're just making up. But psychology has not done that, right? Psychology hasn't done the legwork where they've observed, memory at some level in some lab, and then now they're speculating about, something that they haven't seen. They just start off deductively. And I know why they do that and how they do that, but to me, it seems like the wrong approach. Now, if you ask what evidence there is for intelligence, the only evidence that anyone can ever point to is some organism's behavior. That's all it is. So if you want to know whether an animal is intelligent, you look at their behavior in a particular context and you judge for yourself whether you would call it intelligent or not. And not everyone might call it intelligent, so you might have disagreements, but it's all based only on that individual organism's behavior in that context. That's the only thing we ever observe from which we infer or talk about intelligence. So I have no problem with the word intelligence, but I prefer it as an adjective rather than a noun. So instead of someone has intelligence, I would prefer to say, I would call their behavior intelligent.
Does that just make a proxy for us? We still want to measure something. How do we then measure the behavior?
Well, behavior is easy to measure because almost all of it is observable. So, like, for example, intelligence tests, well, all they do is measure behavior. They just measure someone's answers to some, made up questions. That's all you observe. That's all there is. If you observe, I don't know if it, I mean, you said that this series was on animal intelligence. Well, I have a cat, and my cat does some pretty intelligent things, right? Intelligent as an adjective. But I can see those things. I see what she does. And I have trained her to do those things for that matter. So I know where the behavior comes from, and I call it intelligent behavior. I'll bring people over and say, I have a really smart cat. Watch what she does. And then they'll say, well, how did that come about? Is that because she's intelligent? I'm like, no, it's because I trained her. That's where it came about. And that's the same with humans as well. But anyway, that is getting a little further afield from your question.
Well, I have some intuitive sense that intelligent though your cat may be, I'm somehow more intelligent than the cat. Am I playing into the myth, or is there a basis to that somehow?
It's only based on somebody's behavior in a particular context. So can my cat talk or read or write or construct a podcast? No. In that regard, I would say you're more intelligent. However, if you're both in my backyard and it's nighttime and you're both hungry and you both have to catch a mouse and eat it, I'm going with the cat.
Absolutely, yeah. So context must play a big role then in any analysis of intelligence.
It plays a big role, and the behavior in that context plays a big role.
Do we have general definitions of intelligence, or is it just we say that's to be put to the side and let's talk exclusively about behavior?
Well, that would be my predilection. I've taught intro psych for years and years. And if you go to the chapter on intelligence, there's a definition there. But who came up with that definition? And is it the same definition as another psychologist or somebody else? And the answer is, of course not. If you look at the natural sciences, let me just say that my preference is for psychology to be more like a natural science than it is. And my specific field within psychology, which is behavior analysis, it is a natural science. It is one of the very small, few net parts of psychology that really is a natural science. But if you go to the natural sciences, they all have the same definition of gravity, right? All physicists and astronomers have the same definition of gravity. All biologists have the same definition of cell or nucleus or whatever. But talk to psychologists and ask 100 psychologists or 10 psychologists the definition of intelligence. And so there's a big difference between the natural science, where they all operate under the same assumption. And by the way, those definitions aren't just made up. You don't just make up a definition. Definitions in the natural sciences are induced from experimental laboratory findings. So if you go into the laboratory and you do an experiment, and that experiment is replicated across situations, across time, across whatever, and you find the same thing every single time, there's a definition for you. But in psychology, obviously, that doesn't happen because, well, for a number of reasons. But
could you share the essentialist perspective on intelligence, even if you don't necessarily agree with it? What's the steel man for that point of view?
well, there's a distinction between essentialism and selectionism. Prior to Darwinian theory of natural selection, Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, prior to that, people believed that traits that individuals had, whether they were human or animal, were all essentialistic traits. Like we're born with, Noam Chomsky's notion of a language acquisition device would be an example of an essentialistic trait. Or saying that we're born with intelligence would be an example of an essentialistic trait. Essentialism, has been popular throughout the ages. There's an essence of something called intelligence, or there's an essence, for example, of something called cat. Whatever cat you take, it doesn't matter, but there's an essence of catness there somewhere that is immutable and eternal. And of course, selectionism, as first proposed by Wallace and Darwin, is the exact opposite. It talks about forms coming about as a result of selection by consequences. B.F. Skinner called them selection by consequences. So, in natural selection, if an organism comes into the world with some genetic variation that enables that organism to live long enough to pass on the genes along with that genetic variation, well, that's been selected, not consciously selected by some god or entity, but selected nonetheless. And over, long periods of time and sometimes short periods of time, you get new forms. So there's no essentialism. There's no essential trait or quality. Some of them survive and some of them don't. And that's what happens over the eons of evolutionary time. Colleagues of mine and I take the same approach with respect to behavioral traits. Right? There's no essentialistic intelligence. There's just behavior. And we either call it intelligent or we don't. And as you said, context matters. So Would we call that behavior intelligent in a particular context, or would we not? Two people might disagree. Someone might say, well, that's not very, I wouldn't call that intelligent behavior. And another person would say, oh, I would call that intelligent behavior. But either way, we're observing behavior in its context and we're assigning a label to it, an adjective. It's either intelligent or highly intelligent or not so intelligent.
There is definitely a strong desire to make intelligence a quantitative trait. We'd like to go in with the right ruler and measure it.
Mhm.
Is that the wrong approach entirely, or is there something to that?
That's the wrong approach entirely.
What are the alternatives then?
Well, as I pointed out in my paper, there's a history of conceptualizing intelligence. Well, at least there's a short history. The short history, is the history that led to the intelligence testing movement. And as I noted, and as other people have noted, Binet and Simon's first intelligence scale was not anything like what it was turned into by Spearman and Terman and people like that. They were out to solve a practical problem. How can we identify children in a school setting who need interventions to help them improve and succeed? And so they developed this battery of tests, not to measure intelligence, but just to see what level of skills these kids had, so that they could go in and teach them and get their skill level up. That's a completely pragmatic, reasonable, logical approach to design and assessment. But that's not what happened with the intelligence movement, as you well know. It became what you described. It became this notion where intelligence has some not just a qualitative feature, but quantitative. And of course, if you believe that, then you should be able to design some tests that can measure that quantity. And of course, the IQ test with an IQ score seems to do that. And I'm not completely well versed, and I wrote the paper years ago, so I'm not completely well versed in that. But I know that there have been persistent and serious critiques by people smarter than me about the whole intelligence testing movement, and it's pretty much fallen out of favor, I would say, with respect to how we use it in the culture. But of course, it was used for years as a racially biased assessment. I mean, conceptually, it started with Francis Galton, who was a racist and a misogynist. I don't blame him for that. That was his context. That's how he was brought up. But that's what colored that whole movement. There are a whole bunch of reasons why the intelligence testing movement, I think, has fallen out of favor. But from my perspective, it's fundamentally flawed in the sense, like you mentioned, it's measuring anything, any kind of quantity or quality. It just measures answers to questions on a test.
So if we take a more behavioralism approach, let's just assume whatever experiment we're doing, we're capturing tons of data, we've got videos of our subjects, that has to get labeled, like, oh, the subject is annoyed or is happy or made a good choice or a bad choice. Is there room for ambiguity in those labels? Could I bring biases to the table there?
Well, number one, I don't think you have to label it with those things. If you want to communicate with the lay public or the broader audience, then it probably helps to do that. It helps to use terms that lay people can understand. And of course, that's all of psychology. Psychology has no technical terms, or very few technical terms. You go take a physics class or a biology class or a chemistry class, they're not using terms like that. They're not using terms that everyone knows and understands. You have to learn these technical terms that have very specific, circumscribed meanings. But in psychology, all the terms are the terms everybody knows: consciousness, perception, memory, personality, feelings, emotion. Oh, I know those words, right? If you do good behavioral research, you're just describing the behavior that you're observing, and you're not giving it any kind of quality, no label, unless you want to communicate with, like if you want to promote it with in a newspaper or a magazine or online to the general public, well, then it helps. Like, black hole, for example. That's not really what it is. It's not really a black hole, the way that physicists would describe it, but that's the way that they would communicate to us about it, and helps us understand kind of casually what it might be. But if I were going to do really good behavioral research, I wouldn't use those terms. I would just describe the behavior. I would count the behavior or measure it in whatever way. I would try to identify the variables that are responsible, that cause that behavior, so that we can be sure what causes it. And then if it's important, then you can label it. And as I said, I have no problem with the word intelligent as an adjective. But once you make it a noun, as I tell my students, what are nouns? What did you learn in third, fourth grade? What are nouns? Persons, places, things. Well, is intelligence a person? No. Is it a place? No. Is it a thing? No. Well, what is it? It's just a word. When do you use that word? Different people use the word differently depending upon what behaviors they observe and in what context they observe those behaviors. That's okay. But when you start treating it as a thing, then you commit the error of reification, which is commonplace in psychology and in the lay world. It's not common in the natural sciences. There's not very much, if any, reification. When people talk about atoms or they talk about planets that you can't see or supernova or whatever, they're not taking some abstract concept and treating it as if it's a real thing. They really are talking about something real and concrete and potentially measurable.
Do you find that I guess I'm going to ask, the rate of reification errors is declining or getting worse as you look through the history of published literature? Are people getting this idea and bringing it into their own publications?
I think it's probably getting better because I think people are, and when I say people, I mean, have degrees in psychology. So for me, I'm talking about psychologists mostly. More people are identifying it and recognizing it when it occurs. However, that's not to say that, it's getting better, but I still see it. I still see it frequently.
Well, are there any challenges you expect experimentalists to bump into taking a behavioral paradigm?
Well, I think experimental behavior analysts, have been criticized in the past for not dealing or experimenting with things that are important to everyone. So, for example, B.F. Skinner and his colleagues back in the late 50s and then from then on studied what they called schedules of reinforcement. So, what does that mean? Well, that means that a reinforcer, which is a consequence that follows a response and results in an increase in the probability of that response under similar circumstances, there are a number of different ways those reinforcers can be delivered. And depending upon how they're delivered, they generate consistent and replicable patterns of behavior in the organisms in whom they're studied. Well, Skinner and his colleague Förster published a book in 1957 called Schedules of Reinforcement. And it's a very big, thick book. And it has hundreds and hundreds of cumulative records of pigeons mostly responding under various schedules of reinforcement. Now, to me, it's a beautiful example of elegant experimental analysis because they really identified what are the variables responsible for these patterns and rates of behavior. They were replicated ad nauseum, so there's no question, about the causes. But somebody looking at it from the outside would say, "What is that?" First of all, what do pigeons have to do with me? And that was another criticism, like, what does a rat have to do with me? And I have good answers for those questions, by the way. We share about 70% of our genes with rats. We have very similar nervous systems. Now, you're smarter than a rat because you have a bigger brain with more plasticity. But the basic biology is very similar between rats and humans. Pigeons have incredible eyesight and color vision. So you can use them to study all kinds of visual stimuli, visual situations. But nevertheless, the criticism is when I'm looking at all these cumulative records of pigeons, what does it have to do with humans? What does it have to do with me? That's not an invalid criticism. However, it's possible that the things that people think are important in their lives, intelligence, for example, could be at least partially interpreted in terms of schedules of reinforcement, the rate of behavior. How often do you respond in a particular setting? If you respond very slowly in a particular setting, you might be called not so intelligent. If you respond more quickly in a particular setting, you might be called more intelligent. And I'm just saying that's a possibility. Well, if that's true, then schedules of reinforcement can illuminate the causes of behavior that occurs at a low rate versus that occurs at a high rate. So I think one of the problems with experimental behavior analysts is that maybe we haven't drawn those comparisons, those analogies very clearly enough. But I don't think that the basic research with non-humans is flawed in any way. And I think the criticism that it doesn't deal with important human things, I don't think that's valid. But I think we haven't probably made the case of how some of that research, in fact, can illuminate the things that we are interested in, whether it's memory or, and again, memory is a noun, so I prefer the term remember, which is a verb, but memory, consciousness, all those things. If those terms are really just terms, then we need to look at the behavior that causes us to use those terms. And once we do that, then we have a pretty large body of experimental research from which we can try to explain that behavior.
I think I get the high level of the behaviorist approach to intelligence where, given some training rounds, you're able to learn the stimuli and pick it up. That's all very measurable. Can we do the equivalent things with consciousness? That one seems a bit more slippery.
Well, of course, yes, I understand that it seems slipperier, more slippery, slipperier, more slippery. But it's really not. If you Here's the question that I teach all my undergraduate students when we deal with these concepts, because it's a dead end to try and debate the definitions of these concepts. Psychologists, philosophers, neuroscientists, for hundreds of years, if not longer, have debated these concepts, and it's gotten them nowhere. They're still debating them. So to me, that seems like a dead end. To me, the question that I teach my students is, when you use one of those words, when you say someone is conscious, or when you say someone is remembering, or when you say someone is intelligent, you have to look at the behaviors that that individual engages in that causes you to say intelligent or remembers or is conscious. And so I wrote a whole paper for Skeptic Magazine titled Consciousness is Nothing But a Word. And I went through a series of questions about what kinds of behaviors would lead us to say that someone is conscious or not. Like you asked the question, what about the definition of intelligence? Well, it's the same problem with the definition of consciousness. So why are we going to sit around and I mean, unless you're a philosopher and that's what you like to doing, but why are we going to sit around and debate what the definition of some word is when we can just look at the behaviors someone engages in and say, yep, they're conscious. Nope, they're not conscious. And so like I start with consciousness, for example, if someone's asleep or dead, then we say unconscious. If someone is awake, we say conscious, right? So that's one way. Let's go back to my cat. My cat goes to her food bowl, and that's where she eats. And she goes to her litter box, and that's where she, pees and poops. And she comes when I call her, and she doesn't run into walls. She doesn't walk into walls. She doesn't jump up in the midair to try to land on nothing. She jumps up to land on the sofa or something. So would we say that my cat is conscious of her environment? Yes, we would. What does that mean? It means she navigates her environment. She goes to the right place to eat, etc. If she didn't do those things, if she went somewhere else where there was no food and pretended to eat, or if she walked into walls, then you might want to say she wasn't that conscious of her environment. So that's another way we use the word conscious. Now, for humans, there's a different level of consciousness. We could use both of those for humans too, right? Awake or asleep, navigating our environment or not. But the one that's most relevant to humans, and I think unique to humans, but almost 100% unique to humans, is that we have learned a language that enables us to talk about ourselves. So you might say to me, Hank, are you conscious of how you look? And I would say, yes, I have a cap on, I have glasses on, I have kind of a 5-day, growth of beard here. I have a sweatshirt on, and you are looking at me and you go, yep, got a cap on. Yep, it's got glasses. Yep, got a sweatshirt. Yeah, I can see that 5-day growth of beard. So you know that I'm accurately describing myself. Well, how did I learn to do that? How did I learn to be conscious of my appearance? And the answer is my parents taught me. Because when if you look at how we are with little kids, we ask them questions like, what are you doing? What are you wearing? And in the beginning, kids don't know the answers to those questions. So parents have to give them the answers. And then it gets a little more complex because then they ask us questions like, how are you feeling? Consciousness, self-awareness in terms of having a verbal repertoire about ourselves, my cat doesn't have that. And I think that, I know, you wanted to talk more about intelligence, but I think that this notion of self-awareness or consciousness as having the tendency to be able to talk about ourselves to ourselves, both our behavior and whatever's going on inside of us. To me, that's the blessing and curse of being human.
Well, this might be one for the philosophers, but can we disconnect those things? Can you have intelligence without consciousness, or vice versa?
Well, again, I'm going to have to come back to the way that I approach these things, which is how do we use those words? I would say that my cat has some intelligent behavior. I would also say that my cat is conscious of her environment, and she's conscious when she's awake. I would not say that my cat has self-awareness. She can't talk about herself to herself. She can't tell me, what she looks like. On the other hand, let me suggest this to you. I don't know if you have cats, but you probably know about cats, but cats self-clean. My cat will take her front paw and she'll rub it against her face and then she'll lick it and then she'll clean her claws. So someone might look at that and they might say, she has self-awareness. And I would say, well, what makes you say that? And they would say, well, look, She cleans her claws. She puts her claws in her teeth and she cleans them, or she wipes her face and licks it. And I would say, okay, I'll go with you on that. If that causes you to say that my cat is self-aware, I'll go with you on that. But when we talk about humans being self-aware, what do we mean? Well, we don't mean that we wash our faces or things. We mean that we can describe what we look like. We can describe how we behave. We can describe how we feel. And in order to do that, you have to have human language. My cat just doesn't have it. But there are or have been a few animals, Coco the gorilla, a few chimpanzees, who might have actually approached what we refer to when we talk about humans being self-aware, if their sign language that they learned enabled them to be able to describe what they were doing with signs.
I haven't looked deep into that. Is that convincing? I've heard both ways about Coco.
It depends on what you mean by convincing. One of the critiques that I've heard about the ape sign language, and several apes have been taught sign language. One of the critiques I've heard, which I think is completely flawed, is that their sign language always prompted by some human counterpart. Like Coco is not going to sign unless there's a human there signing with her, prompting her. Well, gee, Kyle, aren't you and I prompting each other right now?
Yeah, it seems like if I knew sign language, I wouldn't sit in my house alone doing it.
No, or you might, but it might be subtle. Like you talk to yourself when you're alone, right? Sometimes you
Sure,
talk
yeah.
out loud to yourself. I don't know. Maybe the chimps had been observed to sign a little bit when they were alone to themselves. But this notion of prompting, I mean, that's the whole notion of communication between individuals, right?
Yeah.
Like you nod your head, you ask me a question, I answer. You nod your head, you ask me another question. So that critique to me seemed very flawed. But it came from people who were sort of like Chomsky, who believed that, and this is an old philosophical notion in humans, that human language is special, that it distinguishes, it's the whole Descartes notion that human language comes from a rational mind that only humans have. We share everything else with non-humans, but not this rational mind that allows our human language. Those kinds of ideas die hard. The note that human uniqueness that's essentialist.
Well, I'm sure you know the story of Clever Hans, the horse that the owner thought could count. Turns out it was just reading the owner's excitement at the right answer. Is that a common pitfall that behavioralists have to worry about as they do experimental design?
Anybody who works with biological organisms, especially humans, has to worry about that. I've written and talked a lot about Clever Hans, but mostly as a form of skeptical thinking, because Clever Hans' owner wasn't trying to scam anybody. He really believed that Hans could do all this mathematical stuff, and he took him around and showed him, and I don't think he made money or didn't make much. And there was a point where a bunch of scientists got together and studied Hans, and they all concluded that he was the real deal. And I tell my students, I said, guys, it was a horse, just to bring it back to reality, right? A horse solving mathematical problems. And then a really brilliant experimental psychologist, from Germany, well, Hans was in Germany too, just designed a really elegant, simple experiment and determined that Hans was being cued by the people who were asking him questions. That particular discovery, well, first of all, there are two things about that. Number one, it answered the question about Hans's cleverness. He was definitely clever, but just not in the way people thought. But you know what? It didn't do anything to squelch people doing that with other animals. There have been animals ever since Hans, horses, pigs, and now we have this movement in autism treatment, which you might have heard of, called facilitated communication.
Terrible.
Terrible. It's become much more refined and subtle now. And it's also branched out into other forms called rapid prompting and speak. What is the speaking to communicate? I can't remember. But in the beginning, it was just conspicuous manipulation. I mean, I'm sure you've seen videos of people with autism, someone holding their hand and just moving it on a letterboard.
Yeah. They're not even looking half the time. It's sad.
Not even looking at it. But now it's become more refined. And so there's still cueing. If you design an experiment to eliminate the cueing, then it falls apart completely. So that Clever Hans stuff, I mean, I'm sure you know this, you're a skeptic. It's hard to teach people to be skeptical. Like my first day of my class, I'll say to my students, I'm the most skeptical person you know. And then I'll ask them, what do you think it means to be a skeptic? And some of them say, well, it means you don't believe in anything. I'm like, no, that's not right. I do believe in things. What it means is I require certain kinds of evidence before I will believe in something. And the evidence that I require, it's demanding. It's demanding evidence. It's not the evidence that you get on TikTok or on Facebook. It's experimental scientific evidence, like vaccines work, that kind of evidence. But it's hard. Very few people know what it means to be skeptical and know what it means to base their beliefs on good, solid scientific evidence.
Well, there's a lot going on in the field of artificial intelligence over the last few years.
Mhm.
I'm curious if you see the insights from the behavioral analysis community having things to offer.
Yes, I do. I've written about AI a couple of times. Again, I don't mind the use of the word intelligence, and I know what they mean by artificial, right? They mean it's not, biological, it's not human. But if you really wanted to, and I know about, the Turing test, which I think is probably not a very good test, but I understand it. If you want to create a machine that has human-like intelligence or that behaves intelligently like humans, what would you have to do? Well, you have to understand how humans learn. And there is one way that I think humans are, maybe better is not the right word, but certainly unique in the animal kingdom. And that is our brains seem to have infinite plasticity or almost infinite plasticity. Most of that plasticity is observed when, kids are very young, when they're 2 years old, birth to 2 or 5 or whatever. But we're learning throughout our whole lives. We learn until the day we die. There's that learning capacity that we have. Well, how do we learn? Well, we learn according to a behavior analytic approach, according to a selectionist based system of laws and principles, just like natural selection. Reinforcement is an example of one of those. So if you engage in some behavior that produces a reinforcer, you're more likely to do that behavior. If you produce behavior that doesn't produce a reinforcer or that produces a punisher, then you're less likely. So behavior is selected based on its consequences. So for me, if people really want to design a machine, well, first of all, I'm not sure it's ever going to be possible. We humans have, if you want to go back to the beginning of evolution on the planet, we have a 3.5 billion year head start. I mean, our brains are the function of 3.5 billion years of biological evolution. But if you want to design a machine that behaves kind of human-like, you have to design a machine that learns from the consequences of its actions. And there's another sort of problem that I see, and that is for humans, for our behavior to be reinforced, we have to want the reinforcers. Like right now, talking to you, my mouth's getting dry. I have a glass of water on my desk here, right? So my mouth gets dry, and so what do? I reach for the glass, I bring it to my mouth, and I tip it and get some water. And as long as my mouth's dry and I want water, then that's what I'll do. If there's a glass here, obviously, if there's no glass there, I won't do that. If the glass is empty, I'll do it once and then I won't do it again. So my behavior is being constantly shaped by the things in my environment. But machines don't want anything. So in order for reinforcers to be effective, like in order for water to be effective, or your head nodding to be effective to reinforce me continuing to talk, or my sweatshirt when it's cool in my house, when I put it on, I want it to be a little warmer. In order for things to be reinforcing, we have to want them. So what does a machine want?
Well, it has a utility function, something like in a game of chess, it wants to win, it wants to maintain a strong position.
I have to think about that because that's a pretty circumscribed situation. Like if but what does it want in general? Like, okay, so if it's going to play chess, fine, I get that. But what does it want in general? And the answer is nothing, because there are no states of deprivation. There's no being too hot or too cold, or being hungry or not being hungry, or being in pain or not being in pain, or having noise be too loud or not be too loud enough. And for us, those things fluctuate constantly in our daily lives. And so they're constantly causing us to engage in behaviors that satisfy those things. So I think you're right. Maybe in a really narrow sense, like with something like chess, yes, it wants to win. How does the machine feel if it loses? Does that motivate it to want to play again and beat the human next time? And see, with us, it's all those motivational things are very complex. But to me, they're all tied into a biological organism that learns. My cat learns, and if you have pets, they learn. I don't know that we've designed a machine that even learns, as much as my cat can learn. My cat still benefits from hundreds of millions of years of evolution. If you really want to design artificial intelligence so that it is not artificial, so that it's intelligent like we would call ourselves, then those are some big hurdles, I think.
And did you have a specific objection to the Turing test? You'd mentioned not being having criticism of it.
I mean, I understand, you're interacting with something, you don't know whether it's human or computer, and you have to make a decision. Am I interacting with a human or am I interacting with a computer? And if you choose human, then it's fooled you. But I don't think I guess I just don't think that's a very good test of that. But it's one test, I would say.
Couldn't we say that if you can't make this decision, if you can't distinguish the human from the machine, then they're behaviorally equivalent?
Only in that very narrow situation, right, that the Turing test is defined as. Here's another example. How about the movie Alien? I'm sure you've seen that movie. Ian Holm played the robot, and he fooled everybody. Everything about him was human as they interacted with him, until, of course, they discovered that he wasn't. To me, that would be a more thorough test than just sitting behind a wall, and not knowing, asking questions or answering, what I mean, and trying to make a determination like that. That would be a better test to me. If the machine learns like humans, learns from the consequences of its actions, then I think that makes it a much more difficult determination of whether something's human or not. And at that point, then maybe it's not even, then maybe the distinction is moot, because then you've created an organism, maybe not a biological one, but then you've created an organism that for all practical purposes is human.
Is there anywhere listeners can follow you online?
I have participated in a number of podcasts. And if they just Google my name, I think maybe I put this on your website or answered your email. I think there's a website that lists all the podcasts that I've done. So they could do that. They could also, I wrote a parenting book 2 years ago, and I have a website for that. It's buildgoodbehavior.com. So they could find me there. And then, people are welcome to email me. My email address is all over the place, all over the internet at Cal State LA.
Sounds good. Yeah, we'll have links to all the above in the show notes. Well, Hanks, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Yeah, thank you for asking me. I enjoyed it.